And we begin today's program in Germany, where the 23rd session of the UN climate talks is drawing an end in the city of Bonn. The two-week meeting is meant to identify tangible steps for the 2015 Paris deal to limit global warming. This year's meeting is a test of how countries around the world managed the landmark deal after the US said it would withdraw by 2020. Before our discussion, take a look at what happened recently.
There are dozens of countries active in the Chinese-led Belt and Road Initiative. Together, they're building massive infrastructure projects to help increase trade, but not always with green energy. That's where China comes in. It has the opportunity to play a leading role in transitioning all these parties away from fossil fuels.
China proposes that each country should first figure out the steps it needs to take to implement the Paris Agreement. Then we can combine these steps into a comprehensive and balanced draft framework that can be used for negotiations next year. We will have a year for negotiations. We might need to organize several rounds of talks to resolve all the differences between countries and try to reach a consensus at the end of 2018.
Dr. Chai Kimin of the National Center for Climate Change Strategy and International Cooperation works closely with the Chinese government on environmental issues.
We are developing some kind of standards or guidelines for the investment overseas in the Belt and Road. And we also encourage the investment on the renewables. We can see a very interesting curve, the investment on the renewables, especially on the solar PV and wind power, is increasing very fast in those countries.
Much of the Chinese government's Silk Road Fund is going towards the development of carbon-conscious infrastructure projects. China now has an increasing number of citizens relying on green energy, and by the end of the decade, Beijing will have committed at least $360 billion to the renewable sector. The country has also launched a range of national low-carbon pilot projects, including more than 50 low-carbon industrial parks.
As we all know, the industry accounts for almost 16% of the carbon dioxide emissions. And also the industry park development is the main driving force of economic growth in China. So the China central government launched the biggest pilot programs in the whole world to promote the industry move the transformation to the green and low carbon development. We need to share the low carbon examples of the industry parks in the One Belt One Road industry parks.
Yet, at the same time, the 2017 climate budget announced at COP23 in Bonn, Germany, predicts China's own carbon dioxide emissions will rise 3.5% this year compared to 2016. Nevertheless, Beijing has clamped down on illegal mining and pollution as it focuses on a shift to cleaner energy.
For more on the Bonn Climate Conference, we are joined in our Beijing studio, Ms. Changhua, who is the Asia-China Director of the Office of Jeremy Rifkin, who used to be former director of the climate group. And also in New York, we are joined by Ethan Zindler, Senior Associate at Energy and National Security Program with CSIS. He's also the head of the policy analysis at Bloomberg New Energy Finance. In Bonn, Germany, we have Jake Schmidt, Director of the International Program at the Natural Resources Defense Council. I want to welcome the three of you. May I start with you, Mr. Schmidt? What do you make of the outcome or lack of outcome of the Bonn COP23?
Well, this is really a COP to set the stage to finalize a series of rules next year that come out of the Paris Agreement. But I think the underlying mood here in Bonn has been around the response, I think, to the Trump decision to pull out of the Paris Agreement. And I think that response has been quite solid. We've seen more countries sign on to the Paris Agreement, and we've seen the largest contingent of U.S. governors and mayors and companies come to an international climate convention and effectively say, Trump may be trying to take the U.S. out of the agreement, but we are still in the agreement, is the catchphrase.
Well, I guess that's not news anymore, because people have been saying about that for almost a year. What is important here is climate financing and also pre-2020 actions by different countries. Let me go to you, Mr. Zindler. As an observer now, you could only be, because you're originally from the United States. You're not necessarily going to be a very big part of it. what about those actions related to these financing and also pre-2020, before the U.S. withdraws all these actions?
So I think it's a very good question. I mean, one of the things that was pledged at the Copenhagen conference 8 years ago and then reiterated 2 years ago was that there was going to be about $100 billion in financing that was going to flow from the wealthiest countries to the less developed countries to facilitate addressing climate change in a variety of ways. One of the things, though, that we've tracked is the flows of clean energy financing, which is a subset of that, as part of a report that we do called Climate Scope. And basically, we're seeing that the total volumes of capital flowing north to south, as you would, has actually not been going up very much in the last 2 years. In fact, from 2015 to 2016, it actually declined by a substantial amount.
What does that say, Mr. Schmidt? Sorry, Mr. Zindler.
So I think there's a number of different things. Actually, one of the countries that saw the largest decline in investment year on year was China, although we do think that that will probably bounce back somewhat this year. But part of it also is that the finance community wants to put money into developing countries. I actually really believe that. But in a number of cases, these countries haven't put in place policies that will sufficiently assure of investors that they're going to get a return on those investments. So 2 years after Paris and a number of years after Copenhagen, I think we're still waiting to see a lot of domestic policy making in a number of these countries that which will create the kind of structures where you can attract private capital from investors. Okay.
Ms. Wu, you've been tracking what is going on here in China. Let's just use China as an example among many of those economies who need to work on this. The carbon market plan has already been drawn up, as Mr. Changhua, the special ambassador on the climate change issue, have been illustrating in Bonn. But of course, this is now going through an examination and also approval process. So what does that mean for China and the other countries using this time to draw up this action plan and implement it?
As we're discussing here, as also reflected by the other panelists here as well, pricing of carbon has been recognized as one of the most significant policy tools to drive the actions to reduce emissions and also to drive the deployment of climate solutions, technologies, and also innovation. And China is expected to create the world's largest carbon market. So the impact will be very significant. And that's why China has spent so much time in the last few years through the piloting scheme, learning the tools and pull things together in order to really roll out a very effective policy tools. And that's not going to be just impacting China, but also globally. I think that's going to be a very significant contribution to global solutions to climate change.
Do we have a timeline for that?
I think so. I think the government has said already we're going to start officially kick off 2018. And that's literally down the road in the coming months. And everyone is looking forward to see that happening.
Right. Well, China is talking about the coming months. There are criticism from some toward Germany, toward Australia, toward Japan, who, among many other countries, have also been committing to carbon market globally and also action plan from its own economy. Mr. Schmidt, what about from Germany? Is there some practical things that can be done immediately in the very near future, particularly concerning carbon pricing and also the carbon market?
Yeah, well, Angela Merkel was under a lot of pressure yesterday when she came to the COP here in Bonn to commit to phasing out or phasing down German coal plants. So that's part of the negotiation that she's undergoing with her coalition to try to get such a commitment, where the Green Party of Germany is pushing pretty hard for a very quick phase down of coal. We've seen, German emissions kind of stagnate a little bit, and I think that's part of what a number of groups are pushing for, is to get the German government to commit to a clear date for when it's going to shift out of the coal-fired power plants in its country.
Yeah, Mr. Schmidt, I certainly understand the complexity of your country. For example, right now you still don't have necessarily a new government, because the coalition government still needs to be formed, and not to mention a new chancellor, likely to be Angela Merkel, and could be a different format when it comes to the government. Meanwhile, the economies, even though are recovering in the West, shall we use that word, but not necessarily to the extent that people would like to be satisfied. So all of this carbon market, carbon pricing could put pressure on the immediate economic performance. Mr. Schmidt, how people are articulating about this?
Well, I think what we've seen around the world, in Europe, in California, Washington State, even in China, is that you can both reduce emissions and increase your economic production. So what we've seen is, I think, a huge growing uptick in clean energy around the world, and that's leading to jobs, job creation, and economic growth. And so we don't have to have this sort of competition between economic growth and environmental protection. And in fact, the countries can actually do a better job of protecting their citizens by protecting the environment and still grow the economy and grow clean energy jobs.
Well, that is beautifully said, Ms. Wu. However, when you know that a country needs to draw upon a plan about its economy, and it needs to monitor very well its growth, employment rate for the immediate future, while at the same time come up with a plan that's likely to transform the whole structure of the economy is not necessarily that easily done, Ms. Wu.
Absolutely. It's a very challenging period of time in our history. And on one side, actually, companies are struggling, countries are struggling, the economy is struggling. So in this current context, of course, the mood of the passive sort of mood is understandable. But in the meantime, actually, if you look at the climate challenge, it's pretty much around here, literally, we are living in it. And in the meantime, if you look at technology innovation, the fourth industrial revolution and the new industrial revolution, we pretty much are offered the tools, the instruments, and to transform. So yes, this is a very critical transition period of time for everyone, for the global community. That's why it requires more urgently than ever the political will, particularly from leading economies. Only by coming together, taking the actions as committed by countries to the Paris Agreement, can we together create much faster, a much larger, different economy, and to lead the transformation. And that's absolutely urgently needed today.
Urgently needed. However, we need to do a choice or not. Whether it is about the national action plan that everybody needs to urgently work on, or actually it has to be a global plan that everybody apply to the same standards, go with the same degree that everybody else would agree upon, so that there will be less pressure on everyone, and yet everybody has quote unquote equal responsibility. When I say equal, I'm not saying the same amount, I'm just saying the share proportion, the fair share proportion of responsibility. Mr. Schmidt.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. I think we actually have to do both, and that's part of what the Paris Agreement is about. It's about getting a global response to that. So you've got all 194 countries participating in it, with the little asterisks around the United States for the next 4 years, hopefully. But countries came up with their own individual plans for how they're going to cut emissions, and the idea is to strengthen those over time towards this collective objective that we have. So, we both have to have a global response to this, but we have to have tailored plans that meet the needs of individual countries, because we need those countries to be able to be prepared to actually deliver it, and it's not useful to have them make promises that they can't actually live up to.
This is interesting, because what does it mean? Where would it leave the United States be, Mr. Zindler? I mean, you still got a delegation going to Bonn for the COP23, but nobody really cares that much anymore about the U.S. delegation. Meanwhile, on the sideline, the U.S. delegation has been talking about the importance of fossil fuels. Of course, everybody was furious against that. Mr. Zindler, when everybody else is working on something that they believe is important, while U.S. is not part of it anymore, at least after 2020, where is the United States? Is U.S. still relevant in any way?
So it's interesting. I mean, certainly the U.S. has had a presence at this week's and last week's talks, and I think Jake can probably speak more to what's actually been going on. But at least reading it from afar, it seems like it's basically been sort of an awkward situation where they're sort of attending a party that they maybe weren't entirely invited to, and offering some comments on the side. The U.S. has said that through the president that they want to get out of this agreement, but that can't literally be executed until basically basically the very end of his term. So you have a situation where the U.S. is essentially still engaged in this process, even though it has stated that it wants out of it at the end of the day. So it's been a little awkward. I would say it's not fair to say that no one cares about the U.S. Certainly, you know, they had one side event, as I understand it, to talk about fossil fuels, and by the way, also talk about nuclear power, which is a zero carbon source of energy. And there were quite a lot of protesters there. So clearly people do care what the U.S. has to say. I would also point out one last thing, which is that there's been quite a presence there in Bonn of state and local officials who've come to essentially say that the U.S. is not unified in this position, and that there are many leaders at different levels who very much want to stay involved, and there are a lot of policies at the state level and even the municipal level in the U.S. that are really supportive of addressing climate change and supporting clean energy.
So where does it leave to the United States? I mean, when you think about 2020, it's very tricky, right? It could be the next administration coming into power in the United States if, you know, you have a change of administration. That is, of course, a big if. But Mr. Zindler, do you think the U.S. will have the swift entry and the swift exit at any time it wants? For example, about the climate change deal, Paris Accord?
Well, there's no swift exit, really, unless they decide to basically drop out of the entire UN framework, which is a decision they've not made. So they're in it, officially in it. You know, really, I think it's until December of the last year of Mr. Trump's term. So that's a ways off, and so you know, they're not going anywhere in that regard. I think the more interesting question, in some ways, is where does this leave China? Because to some degree, if the U.S. is essentially ceding the role and the leadership.
No, you still haven't answered my question yet, Mr. Zindler. Let's go to China, to the Chinese panelists. But for the United States, I still want to ask you, that is, do you think if there is a change of government, can the U.S. next administration come into Paris Accord and say, well, we just didn't agree with our predecessor, let's just do it all over again? Do you think the rest of the world will agree with that after all the efforts that is being now making along the process? The question really is ultimately, if the U.S. is absent for a few years, is it going to be relevant at all at the end?
That's a very good question, and I honestly don't know the answer. I think one of the reasons why a lot of these other leaders from states and municipalities are over there is because they are trying